thou, O son of man, I have set thee a watchman unto the house of Israel. Therefore, thou shalt hear the word of my mouth, and warn them from me. Have no fellowship with the unfruitful works of darkness, but rather expose them.
Coming to you from an undisclosed location in Middle Tennessee and examining current events from a biblical perspective, this is Bible News Radio with your hosts, Randall and Stacy Harp.
All right. Hello, everybody. I want to welcome you people to this show. Yeah, I do. And we're on here early tonight because I have a very special guest that, I wanted to come on tonight to talk to you about some of the latest information in the world of news. Yeah. So do me a favor. Hey, if you're watching this show live right now, what I want you to do is I want you to go ahead and share it out because you know those liberal platforms. Yeah, you do. You're on it right now. And they're spiking all of us conservative Christian stuff, so, go ahead, tweet it out, share it out on Facebook. If you're on YouTube, go ahead, share it out somewhere, and let people know that we have a wonderful guy on the phone. Yeah, we do. He is on the phone. Almost like clandestine spy type thing. We're going to put up the graphic of his face. Yeah, we are. So, go ahead and tweet the show out. Because today, we are going to talk about this brand new book. Yeah, it is. Check that out. Progressive Evil. Let me read you the subtitle. How Radicals Are Redefining America's Rights, Institutions, and Ideals, Making Her Globally Irrelevant for the End Times. Yep. And who is the author of this great book, you might ask? Well, I'm going to tell you. It's Lieutenant Colonel Robert L. Maginnis, who is retired from the Army, by the way, and he's a Washington insider, and he has grandchildren even. Probably didn't know that, did you? Insider info. Let me tell you a little bit about this man. He is not only retired from the U.S. Army, he graduated from the U.S. Military Academy, the Naval Postgraduate School, the Command and General Staff College, and the Army War College's strategy course. And a whole bunch more right there in very small print. Just so you know. We'll get more info after he gets on there. All right, people. So thank you for joining us tonight. Hope that you had a good Friday. I had a great day yesterday as well. Today is Saturday. My day kind of I was like, what day is today? Oh yeah, it's Saturday. Today I went and I visited my dad, who is 91. And we just celebrated his birthday, people. We had cake and ice cream. And my dad, you know what else? He had a root beer float, people. Because he likes root beer. And he likes ice cream. Together. Okay. All right. And as always, I want to thank Bareface for producing this show. I really appreciate it, Randall. Thank you for doing that. Okay.
My pleasure.
All right. There you are. You handsome hunky man.
Son Stacy.
Yeah. Well, that was the first mistake, right? To send me? No, I'm just kidding. Okay. All right. So you guys, look, I was telling you about this a couple of days ago. We were talking to somebody, and I asked all of you guys if I should have Bob Maginnis on the show. And you were like, I was like, put a 1 if you want me to. And there was like all these ones. And I was like, oh, there's affirmation. Okay, we should do it. So I called Bob up because I met him a couple of years ago. And he was gracious enough to accept the invite. And so he's going to be with us tonight for the hour. And so if you guys have any questions or comments during the show, just feel free to put them in the chat box wherever you're at. Okay? And then we will answer them if they're appropriate. If they're not, then we'll just ignore it because I have that right, just so you know. But most of you guys are pretty cool. Hey, Mama Gina, Melanie, and Sean, and Danielle, and all you other guys out there. Andre, thank you for coming in. Okay, I'm going to also share this out as well. Tweet that out. All right. All right. So, Bob, welcome to the show. You're here. Glad that you're here. Wait, hold on. I should unmute you.
On YouTube, though.
There, I unmuted you. Okay, hello, Bob.
Hello, Stacy. How are you?
I'm good. I am so good. I'm so happy you're here. Okay, so Not only was I super happy to meet you in Oklahoma a couple years ago, when I met you, I was super, super excited about that because I just thought you were so cool. I always love to meet people who not only are patriots, but also who are in our government. Because for the first time, the very first time I went to Washington, D.C., like on vacation, and I was walking through, not only all the memorials and stuff, but I was walking through everything. I was just like, this place is amazing. Just the godly heritage of the country and all that. And Randall can tell you, I was almost like walking on sunshine. I was walking like so happy up and down the streets of Washington, D.C., thinking, this is America. And I'm proud to be an American. So the fact that you're a veteran and you've served in our government for so long is just admirable to me. And it's just really an honor to have you on the show.
Well, it's my pleasure.
Okay, so for those of you who may not know who Bob is, go ahead and tell us a little bit about your background, beginning when you were born. Like, how long ago was that?
A long time ago, Stacy. I was out of Florida, Orlando, Florida, and then my parents were separated, and I grew up with a stepfather in California, L.A. area, and then lived in Alabama and Tennessee. From Tennessee, I went to the military academy, and after 4 years there, I went to Korea. Came back to the States, spent several years at the Middle West, Kansas, Oklahoma, and back to California, then back across the ocean to Germany, back again to California, back to the Southeast where I served at the infantry school, spent some time in Alaska, been elsewhere as well, eventually ended up in the Pentagon back in 1990, where after serving as an inspector general, I retired, joined the Family Research Council, served there almost a decade, came to the Pentagon, and have been at the Pentagon for the last 17 years, still there. And I do a host of things on the side, one of which is write books.
Yeah, that is so cool. That is so cool. What a life you've led. Okay, and you mentioned you have grandchildren, which means you've been married. How long have you been?
Oh, yes.
How long have you been married?
43 years.
43 years. Wow. There
43.
you go. That's great. Well, I shouldn't say this, but that's almost my whole life. Yep.
Well, it's certainly a big part of mine. So.
That's great. Okay, so obviously you have children and grandchildren. That's great. So and I'm just trying to give people your background. So, and you're a believer. You're a follower of Jesus, right?
Right. I was baptized as a 16-year-old, though I was an infant as well. I came to Christ as a teenager, and then really didn't surrender my life until I was a young lieutenant in the U.S. Army when I was in the great nation of Korea, South Korea. And then have grown tremendously since that time. Long time ago, though.
Yeah, wow. That is amazing. I was going to say that's crazy, but I don't mean that in that way. But that's very cool. Okay, so, and you mentioned Korea. My dad, who I was just talking about a minute ago, he served in the Korean War. And he still talks a lot about it to this day and all that. So I'd be interested in hearing some of your experiences in Korea. Just one.
Oh, goodness. Yeah, that is dated. I think probably the most memorable, because I was not in the Korean War. I'm much younger than that. But I think the most significant was I was amongst 1 million people on what was it, Yeouido Island, which is in the middle of the city of Seoul. And there's a river around there, so that's an actual island. But we went to a revival of sorts, in which friends of mine sang, and a number of people from Campus Crusade for Christ spoke, and it was an exciting time. As certainly for a young lieutenant serving on the demilitarized zone as I was, to come down and to join a million other believers in revival.
Wow, that is so cool. Well, you know what? I mean, I have a heart for the persecuted church worldwide, and wrote the Voice of the Martyrs persecution blog actually for 8 years. And so when I think about Korea, I don't always think of South Korea, because I usually think of North Korea, where the believers are being persecuted.
Oh, yeah.
And yet at the same time, that's kind of a good segue into currently what's happening here in America. Now, your book, Progressive Evil, here, I'm just going to hold it up, Randall. You don't have to put the graphic up. But this book, obviously, I didn't read the whole thing yet, but I did read some of it. And I have to let you know that I'm happy that you're here to talk about it, because I hear that, there's a reason why you wrote this book, and I think you need to talk about it. So go for it.
Well, there are a number of reasons I wrote it.
That was a poorly worded way.
Yeah, I thought it was an important topic, given what's going on in the culture. So
right.
Yeah, and I don't think people really understand the history of progressivism. The early history, which is not all that bad, though it did begin with a combination of Hegel and Kant and Marx and some others that contributed to the ideology. But it is an ideology, it's sort of a religion of sorts. But it did a great deal of good initially during the progressive era, which was 1890 to about 1920. And during those years, it worked for the underdog, for the former agrarian society that all of a sudden was thrust into the industrial society, industrial age revolution of sorts. They were smack dab in the middle also of the Gilded Age, which of course was when a very small fringe of society was rich, and the rest of them were working in basically factories for pittance, for very little. And so the abuse of people, child labor, the abuse of women, the abuse of the workers was sad, and it was really, you created an upsurge of interest to try to reform. And so you had the beginning of ideas that said, look, we can make life better for everyone if we do certain things. And so you began to see reforms. Reforms, came in the form, there were some constitutional reforms, but there were also, food and drug laws that eventually got to Congress to protect the average person. There was certainly work against the antitrust and the monopolies that, interestingly, the Supreme Court had in fact granted to companies to get them to develop the United States. So well-intended initially, but they got out of hand. Then, of course, you had a host of other things. You had political reform, which was absolutely necessary because certain political parties and organizations were taking more power than they should from the people. So that's when we began to see direct primaries and voter initiatives and referendums and recall actions. All things that really serve the interest of the majority of the people, not the special interests. You had, of course, you had unions that started up, but you also had other issues. You had a government that started to really grow and to become bloated. You had the amendment that allowed for the federal income tax, which I'm sure is not popular with a lot of people, and understandably. You had women's suffrage. So you had a lot of important things that happened, from the late 1890s up until, arguably, you could say up until Franklin Roosevelt's time. But of course, Woodrow Wilson was very significant, a big progressive, though a Democrat. Yeah, Teddy Roosevelt, of course, was progressive, but a Republican. So it's both parties. And then, of course, Franklin Roosevelt in his New Deal really grew government and grew individual dependency. He created Social Security. He created a host of programs that really rapidly expanded the power and began to attack the things that I'm interested in. I address in Progressive Evil, the rights, the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments that our founders gave us. Progressives have really whittled away at those over the years. And of course, the key institutions that undergird our country, and then of course the ideals that made America an exceptional place in all across the world. So those are the things that are the grist, kind of the content of Progressive Evil, because I go through explain the civics of where we came from and what progressives have done to it and where we are today. And so that's kind of the broad view. We can, of course, delve into any of those topics as you see fit.
Yes. Well, I think it's important for people to understand that history and the backdrop, especially since, my generation and under, I just turned 50 a couple months ago, and I have to say that my husband kind of jokingly at times says, when I don't know something that I should know, he's like, oh, it's because you were raised in, you went to public school or you didn't learn anything. And I'm like, but I went to private school in college, so I know a little bit, but we don't know our history, right? And, if we don't know our history, then obviously that can impact us the way that we currently live today, right? So,
absolutely.
And that's one of the things I want to point out to everybody in the audience. Check this out. This back section here, this notes section, is pretty thick. So Bob here actually footnotes everything. I don't even know how many footnotes you have in here, but
they're over 1,000.
Over 1,000. Okay, so yeah, like Carl Tykrib, when I talked to Carl not too long ago, and he's like, yeah, I have 5 million footnotes in the back of my book, and he practically did. So these are the best type of books to read. You know why? Because if you're a researcher and you really want to dig in the truth, you want to verify what the author is talking about, you go check out their sources. So, and that actually goes to the area of education and how progressives have actually tried to rewrite history and not tell stuff. In fact, like one, let's bring up a topic. This is probably a hot topic, but 9/11. Where were you on 9/11? Just out of curiosity.
Oh, I was in Washington at the time. I was the vice president for the Family Research Council.
Okay.
And I was conducting a meeting with my staff, and we started to hear out on the streets of Washington a great commotion because, of course, the Twin Towers had been hit and the Pentagon was hit. And so I was very near the FBI building. So there was a lot of activity, and it wasn't too many hours before Washington was cleared out because I was very much in the media at the time and had specialized to a certain degree on terrorism, especially Islamic terrorism. I did, and you can find online quite a bit of television and radio during that time. And I was one of the few that actually had written about Osama bin Laden before 9/11, calling attention to what he had done in Sudan and what he had done in Afghanistan, and of course what his long-term plans were. So it wasn't a surprise to me.
Right. And, part of the reason I bring that up is not only because you were there, but also if you look at today's history books and how they rewrote history there, you wouldn't see pretty much what you know, right?
Yeah, well, and that's a lot of it's by design. If you go back to John Dewey and how he kind of reconfigured during the 30s and 40s our whole education establishment. We started off with the common school across the nation, and the first was, of course, the Latin schools that copied what was going on in Germany and elsewhere, and maybe Switzerland as well, and a couple of European countries. But it came to Boston. The real first public school was the Latin school there, about the time Harvard was established. It was actually a year prior. And then they emphasized the important things: reading, writing, arithmetic.
Right.
And of course, in that case, Latin, because they felt that an educated person had to speak more than one language, and Latin was the language of choice at the time. Those common schools spread across the entire country by virtue of the men going and families going west, and it was all pretty. We were a very literate country, even up to and beyond the Civil War. But things started to begin to change, like I said, in the early part of the 20th century, when progressives decided, well, we ought to use this as an opportunity to remake America's people and start with the children. The advisor, the social scientist that advised Theodore Roosevelt, basically says, what we want to do is take these pieces of plastic kids out of homes and put them on the kneading board of our school system and basically re-socialize them so that they can better fit in and be productive citizens in our society. So that was the thinking of progressives as far back as the early part of the 20th century. And then, of course, others came along, and we ended up discarding 4 years of history that the typical student would get and replaced it with social science, what it became called. And we abandoned most of the civics that was taught up until 4 or 5 decades ago, which was a primary topic because it told you about our government, how it was formed, what your rights and privileges are, what the Bill of Rights meant, what the Declaration means, what the Constitution and all the articles mean, and how the government functions. You really don't get that anymore. And so Americans typically, unless they really make an effort, are left without an understanding of their civic responsibilities and how their government functions. And so when progressives did that by design so that they can come in and rewrite our Constitution, which of course they want it to be a malleable document. Right. And so they want to manipulate it in a way that fits their ideology. And of course I can go in and explain the ideology as you may see fit. But the education is in the bag for progressives because they control not only the public education system, but they also control the teachers' colleges, and they've created what we call curriculum developers who basically tell you what you're going to teach, and we don't emphasize expertise. Even if you're a math teacher, surprisingly, you're not getting that much math in a education college. You're getting mostly curriculum development and how to deliver certain things, but you're not learning a lot of math like we used to. So there's some distressing things that the American education system had to go through. But I put a lot of blame on, the fact that, we rank so low amongst the developed world that it's appalling. What is a fifth of our people can't even read the documents that our founders wrote. It's for a nation that spends, about $13,000 a year for every student in America. That's not a very good return on the investment.
No, and what's really interesting is I'm glad that you brought up the whole issue of curriculum because I remember it was probably, 2019, probably 2002, my husband and I were asked by the Traditional Values Coalition if we would go into a GLSEN conference, and you know what that is, right? The Gay, Lesbian, Straight Education Network. Oh, yeah. We went in there as spies, and this was kind of like my first undercover thing for the right, So we go in there as spies in order to find out what it was that the homosexual lobby was doing as far as education. I'll never forget this because, first of all, it was in Los Angeles. We were still living in California at that point, but we were down there in Los Angeles. There was drag queens. There was, the whole, the leadership that we all know about. Anybody who knows anything about who's in that area. And I collected literally a box full of the curriculum, and I sent it to Janet Parshall. At the time, I was just a listener of hers, and I literally packed it up. I shipped it to her show, Janet Parshall's America, at the time that was on. And Janet actually read the curriculum that I sent her on her show, and I actually still have the audio clip of it. Not right now, I don't have it available, but I do still have it, where she was even shocked at what these guys were doing in order to indoctrinate homosexuality into kids, including in a music class. And Randall and I, what we did, Bob, was we went back to our church and we were trying to tell our church about what happened at this event. And it was like, la, 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 that. We don't want to hear it. And we kind of felt like, what the heck have we just gotten into? It's almost like we fell down this rabbit hole, and as years progressed, I got my master's in clinical psychology. I began practicing as a marriage and family therapist, and we ended up going to, I was invited to a counseling conference that was run by lesbian psychologists down in San Diego. And I was invited to go into this conference as a therapist, but also as a spy. And there happened to be Chastity Bono, also known as Chaz, was one of the main speakers, and Stuart Milk, Harvey Milk's nephew, he was there, and then there was a whole bunch of other leaders in there. And I'm sitting there and I'm listening to how they were redefining the language that me as a Christian was supposed to be using. Like, I can't use the word gay, the word homosexual, and because according to them, if I did it kind of leans towards the idea of sexuality and sex, and this implies that, we're looking at the behavior of somebody by their definition, but the thing that really got me, and Randall knows this, and this was probably about 2006 or so, somewhere around there. What really got me was that there was a guy who was leading this panel, and he had transitioned from, quote, one gender to another, and his goal was to get children to transition as well. And so what they were doing was they had this panel of parents, and they brought their kids there to testify to the group of therapists, and it was all school counselors, that they were really, really upset because they couldn't find enough doctors to inject hormone treatments into these children. And so I'm sitting in the back about ready to jump out of my skin wanting to punch somebody in the face because obviously, you don't do that to a kid. And of course I'm thinking all my child development training and how children develop and all that. And so I raised my hand and I said, hey, I just have a question. Cause he's like, do you have any questions? And I'm like, yeah. And as calmly as I said, how are you guys going to do what you're doing with all the research out there, Piaget and, all the research that talks about child development? How are you going to explain that away? And to my face, he said, it won't work. It will not matter. We'll just rewrite what we want and not, we'll just do what we want. And if you want to know more, just see me after. Well, knowing me, I didn't want to see him after because, I was about ready to come out of my skin. And yeah, all these years later, 13 years later, we now see this whole thing with the drag queen stuff that are actually pedophiles, and libraries are allowing them, and people are being outraged, like in California, which I know you believe is like a third world nation, and I'd love for you to talk about that. But how do we conquer this when there's so few of us, let's say, Joshua and Caleb's going in and trying to get the info. It's like it's there, but how do we wake up like the church so that we can keep being the light? You know what I'm talking about here?
No, I understand what you're talking about, and I've been a culture warrior for a long time and very concerned about the lack of understanding of the culture and the danger it has for where we've come. Part of my background is that, of course, I'm one of the authors of the Pentagon's Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy. And so when we were researching it after Bill Clinton announced in Vermont in 1992 that he was going to open the military for the service of homosexuals, that interested me as a topic for the military, and so I started to research and write and became one of the primary people that worked on the topic. And in fact, in January of 1993, Bob Dornan, who used to be the congressman there in Los Angeles, invited me to testify to a hearing on Capitol Hill. And of course, I had been studying the homosexual lifestyle from a military perspective, and so I was very forthright in my explanation as to the research and the writing that I had done for the Pentagon on the very topic. It was a sobering testimony that still in C-SPAN, I believe. But I said some of the things that you had mentioned, Stacy. Certainly talked about what their agenda was. In fact, I wrote papers for both House Armed Services and Senate Armed Services while I was at the Pentagon in uniform, saying not only what they had in mind long term, but the things that we've seen fulfilled over the last couple of decades were the things that they had said in their own literature. So they've been very, very successful. And I ended up debating many of the leading homosexuals in the country over the couple of years span there, and they were saying much the same thing as their own literature was. So I'm not surprised. What really shocked me is that back then we found a great deal of resistance to the things that have become commonplace today, and that kind of fits into what I say at the top of progressive evil, and that people need to appreciate the fact that someone like Nikita Khrushchev, who was the former communist leader in the Soviet Union in 1956, said, "We will take America without firing a shot. We do not have to invade the U.S. Right. We will destroy you from within." Well, destroying from within is done through a variety of mechanisms, and certainly redoing the culture, which is what we've seen transformed over the last number of decades. And progressives have played a very key role in that. Certainly the homosexual lifestyle is promoted by progressives. It's embraced by progressives. And I call California a third world country primarily because it's not just the homosexuality that it embraces. It embraces what I consider corrupt government. It destroys the middle class. Today they suffer from medieval diseases. There's typhus. There's even evidence that they could break out in the bubonic plague because of the rat infestation in amongst the homeless, which is the largest in the United States. The taxes are overwhelming, poor social services. Their infrastructure is absolutely crumbling. The gangs are out of control. There's a lack of general security. And yet, California has the best climate, arguably, in the nation. It has a diverse geography. It has major natural ports, access to the Pacific Ocean and great economies across the ocean, timber, agriculture, mining, energy. They have it so well. But progressives have brought about, a quarter of the population lives below the poverty line. It has the poorest, largest segment of the population in the nation and the richest segment of the population in the nation at the same time. More billionaires out there. A third of the nation's welfare recipients live in California. One thing after another. Why? When I lived out there, I remember, Moonbeam Brown's father when he was the governor, and it was, California was a pretty good place to live back in the 60s. But over the last few decades, with nothing but progressive leadership, it has become a cesspool, a third world country, except for a few places. And all you have to do is walk downtown LA, walk downtown San Francisco, and a lot of other places. And you begin to get the impression that, this truly is representative of aspects of a third world country. It's just so sad.
Yeah, I grew up there. I was born in upstate New York, but in 1976, when my parents divorced, I was taken to Riverside and, lived there. And then I lived in Orange County. And my husband and I, we were like, oh my gosh, we got to get out of here. Because, the immigration issue alone, and we literally had a guy move in next door to us from Mexico. They planted their Mexican flag outside their thing, and they said, teach us English. And then they told us they were there illegally, which really did not set well with me because my Filipino neighbor who was on the other side of me came legally and, and all that. So, but I agree. I was just back there about 3 months ago, and I was like, how'd I even live here? Because it has changed in 7 years that I haven't been there. It's just, it's crazy. And the government there, this is what they want the rest of America to look like, I believe. And, we can talk about that after we take our break. Okay, everybody. Hey, if you don't know, my guest tonight is the wonderful Robert Maginnis. And he has written a brand new book called Progressive Evil, How Radicals Are Redefining America's Rights, Institutions, and Ideals, Making Her Globally Irrelevant for the End Times. And not only that, he has written a whole bunch of other books. Here are some of the other titles. He's written Alliance of Evil, which was published last year. And then he wrote another book that I actually talked to him a little bit about, 2017, called The Deeper State, Inside the War on Trump by Corrupt Elites, Secret Societies, and the Builders of an Eminent Final Empire. Before that, he wrote Future War, Super Soldiers, Terminators, Cyberspace, and the National Security Strategy for the 21st Century Combat, and more. You guys can go over to our Bible News Radio Amazon page, which is right there on your screen, I think. So if you go to amazon.com/shop/Bible News Radio, you can go there, get the book through our link. That will help support us. A couple dollars will if you all buy it today. Buy it today, people. Go get them all, actually. You guys need to be educated by somebody who's there, who's been there, done that. He gets it. All that. Also, don't forget our other sponsor, Ariel Ministries. Dr. Arnold Fruchtenbaum, Messianic Jewish believer, founded this ministry many, many decades ago. And if you go there, you can use the coupon code Bible News, and you can save 20% on anything you get there. And you can understand the Bible in the Jewish perspective it was written if you do that. So we want you to do that. And of course, if you just want to donate to our show, you can go over to BibleNewsRadio.com over there, and you can donate through the website. By the way, I want to thank you guys for coming in. As you guys know, Twitter, Periscope, which is owned by Twitter, we have almost 6,000 followers on Twitter and in Periscope, and they spike the show. They hide us on purpose. So if you guys just share this out again, that would be awesome. And then, of course, YouTube is owned by Google, who wants to have the mind of God, and they hide us as well, So if you don't mind sharing it out again, we will be posting this on Facebook and other places. And you know what, you guys, this really is a war. It really is, because I refuse to take this show and put it on Christian networks, because I'm not here to get Christians. I'm here to get disciples, to make disciples, and also to fish for men. You know what I mean? And I think that's what's important. We need to remember the gospel of Jesus Christ. We need to remember why Jesus came. And if you're born again and you're blessed enough to be born again, we have to be out there. We got to be the light in the darkness. And trust me, it's a dark, dark hour. And, you know, I actually thought, Bob, that when we moved here to Tennessee, I was going, oh my gosh, I'm escaping California. Yay. You know, we're going to the promised land, Middle Tennessee, you know. And when I got here, I was like so shocked at the culture in the Bible Belt. I mean, it's considerably better than California by any stretch. But the thing is, it's a cultural Christianity. It's not a very deep biblical, I'm going to make disciples Christianity, which actually really concerns me, because how are we supposed to impact the culture for Christ when we have biblically illiterate people who won't even open the Bible to read it, or they won't even talk about these issues that we're talking about? I'm just curious.
Well, Stacy, the church has I think has earned the proper rap over the years in terms of having abandoned his first love and not being dedicated to responding to Christ's mandate to be the salt and the light. And what that means is something that our founders gave us, and that is in the First Amendment. They said you can practice your religious freedom. Religious freedom means that, you know, if you're a believer in Jesus Christ and in the Bible, the Word of God, then that should be your guide in working with your neighbor and your community and your nation. And so if you see evil, something God calls evil, then you are obligated to call it out. Unfortunately, in cultural Christianity today, we only, praise the Lord inside the confines of four walls, but when we get out there in the dirty world, the evil world, we don't, shine the light of Christ as we should. And so one of the reasons I think this nation is in serious jeopardy right now is because even the remnant of those that love Christ, that are followers of Him, that understand His Word, that are, steeped in the Bible, are not being true representatives within the culture. If they were, then we would have more people, declaring the very things that we've been talking about over the last 30 minutes and much more as evil and wrong, and we'd start doing things about it. So these are things that I deal with in progressive evil. The reason I call it evil is because the things that God calls evil, I must call evil.
Right.
That I have no excuse. He calls homosexuality an abomination. I must do that. I'm a sinner. I do things that I'm ashamed of. I do things that, Christ forgives me of. But at the same time, I should not be bashful about being the light that I must be. Often Bible believers, people that are open about their faith, make others feel very uncomfortable because it's convicting. Their conscience hurts. But of course, there are others that are so far gone that they're almost demon possessed, and they don't understand what's going on. We live in a very spiritual world, and yet there's a lot of spiritually dead Christians out there that are just cultural Christians and have no understanding as to the dynamics of what is all about them. So these are tough issues, things that I deal with in progressive evil, and try to explain. One of the things that I illustrate, I talk about what's called the banality of evil, and I'll explain that if you'd like, because I think it's important for our country, especially Christians, to appreciate how insidious the threat that I see really is. And it really begins, the idea, tracks back to an interesting trial in 1961 of Adolf Eichmann. It took place in Jerusalem, and it was a Nazi war crime tribunal. And a young female German Zionist, Hannah Arendt. Hannah wrote an article for the New Yorker because she was going to report on the trial of Eichmann, and then that morphed into a book later on. And Hannah described Eichmann as a banal man, a boring man, normal man, unimportant, she wrote, stupid, uninterested, an imbecile. And then she goes further in her writings, and she begins to make the Jewish population that, after the war feel very uncomfortable about themselves, and for the most part the Germans that survived as well, because she asked questions like, here the SS, the Nazis were, taking Jews by the millions, putting them in trains and shipping them off to the concentration camps and putting them to death. And what were the Jews doing? Why weren't they fighting? Why were they just sitting there allowing themselves to be taken captive and shipped? And why were the Germans, there were a lot of German Christians, why weren't they doing anything? Why were even the Jewish leaders complicit in, turning, Jewish property over to the Aryans? Why was all this happening? Chuck Colson uses an illustration, which I often remember, in which, because I've been to north of Munich, a concentration camp there, and my father-in-law helped liberate that at the end of World War II, and the German Christians had a church right next to the railroad tracks, and as the trains loaded with Jews would come by and they were in their church, all they would do is sing louder so that they couldn't hear the rumble of the trains going past carrying the Jews to their death. They tried to turn a blind eye to it. So why did this all happen? Well, this is what Hannah calls the banality of evil. It's in other words, what has become almost a matter of fact. In the culture, they rationalized things as being good. Now, how did this come about? Well, one, they said, well, look, the Nazis were in charge. They passed laws. They were people in authority. And all we were doing is obeying the government authority that had been put in place. We were obeying the law. And we obviously had to do that. And of course, the German authorities at the time declared the Jews as subhuman, and right. They were then taken care of. Then the second thing is that there is a moral communal permission, something that allows the culture to rationalize an evil, even though they felt within them that their consciences were hurt. They were affected by what they were seeing. There became almost the searing of their conscience and a communal permission to do what was being done within the culture to extricate the Jews. The education system was also used as a mechanism. Much like in our country, the John Deweys of the world have been manipulating our education system. Well, the Nazis manipulated theirs, and they promoted the Aryan race as being superior and the Jews as being subhuman. So it became us versus them. That became a useful tool within the culture. And then the final part was small incidents in public by those in authority against the targeted population, in this case the Jews. They were initially abusive, and then they became violent, and then the culture began to accept the fact that, well, that's just the way that things are. And so one violent incident led to another, and to another. So they became almost socialized to accept the violence against them because, after all, they were subhuman.
Right.
And so I see these four factors taking place within that culture, and the end result was tragic. And yet, I see elements. Here we have laws that say abortion on demand. Well, that's the law of the land. Why? What's wrong with that? We see violence today, even by questionably by groups that are in authority. We see a communal thinking, a consciousness within the culture that's promoted by our entertainment media, that's promoted by our mass media, manipulating how we think as a culture. All of this is present today, and it's not going in a very good direction, especially if your standard for life is outlined in God's Word.
Right. Yeah. You know what? I could talk to you about this for hours. I really could. And one of the things that really stands out to me about everything that you said is that as you know, it starts with the war of language, right? I mean, we're being told what we can and cannot say, and that and as a result, people self-censor themselves initially, that's how it started, even with the argument about life, right? I mean, Christians in the beginning, when Jerry Falwell was around and doing all that, we talked about the Bible and how in Psalm 139, life, God fearfully and wonderfully made us, right? But then somebody figured out, oh, well, we don't want to use the Bible to describe this because then they'll think we're, these weird Christians or whatever, and we're pushing religion down their face or their throat, whatever. And so we'll just talk about, it from a different perspective, like the medical one, just in the same thing, as has happened with homosexuality, gender, the family, and even things like Islam. And, I know you're a foreign affairs international expert on that. And I just want to ask you about the whole idea of Islam and how we have seen the culture. And I have unfortunately seen this even with people in the church that I know actually embrace the idea of so-called Chrislam and how Islam is supposedly like Christianity and a religion of peace. And how if we actually point out, like Robert Spencer does over on Jihad Watch, all the Christian persecution and what they're doing across the world and how they're bringing it here, then somehow we're the ignoramuses and we're the buttheads and we're the ones that are so intolerant and hateful, when all we're doing is pointing out the obvious thing. And it honestly drives me crazy because I really, I try to be a lady because, I am, but I just sometimes, and then when you look at that and our government is trying to take guns away from us and all that, how do you address that? Because, one of the things that I know is that it's my understanding that by 2020, Islam wants to take over this country. I read that somewhere. You're the expert, though. How do we as a church actually fight that when, I believe their goal is to come into our churches and kill us?
Well, if you read certainly the Quran, the Hadith, and other Islamic writings, and I wrote a book called Never Submit, which at the time was about the genocide of Christians in the Middle East. And then the last section deals with their agenda for the United States, which is a political agenda. You have to understand that Islam is, it takes into account all of life, everything about, what we do, where we eat, who we marry, what we work on, our politics, and so forth. They have no tolerance for anyone outside of their faith. And so as infidels, you can never be equal to a Muslim.
Yeah.
So you really have to look at that. When you were saying that, Stacy, it reminded me of, to a certain degree, what I was talking about moments ago. And the Germans at the time, the German Christians at the time, they adopted a flag that had the swastika on it with the cross, and it said German Christians on it. And that's what they were known for. So the German Christians became just as anti-Semitic and racist as the National Socialists. They were useful idiots for the purpose of the National Socialists and their agenda to destroy the Jewish population and, of course, take over the world. If you study the materials of Islam and you understand what their geopolitical ambitions are, how they administer their faith, you begin to understand there's absolutely no tolerance for we Christians, much less for the Jews. And it's something that that they invest heavily in our prison systems. They're working in our schools. They're working in our government, as we've seen with the squad of late that Nancy Pelosi is trying to deal with. You've seen it in our politics, and of course, it is infecting the church because people in the church often don't take the time to study what that faith represents and what it says about others. All you have to do is go into some of those countries, and I have, and listen to them, and I have, and then of course read their materials, which I have, and you begin to appreciate how radical this is, from our way of life, much less from a Christian perspective. Some of the best apologists for Christianity are people that have fled from the Islamic faith, and how radical it was. And so, and there are a number of very good books out there for people that want to kind of get it from somebody that was a former Muslim. But certainly, I would encourage people, if they want to understand kind of the broad point of view and how it's infiltrating into our country, and I've certainly seen it over the last decades, especially here in the last few years, pick up my book, Never Submit, and you'll appreciate, especially, the application in the back as to what's going on in our schools, as you point out, in our own churches and in our government.
Yeah. Yeah, and I totally concur with you on that because, we've had General Boykin on the show with Kamal Salim. We've had him on. We've also talked to Nani Darwish and also Walid Shubat. We've had him on, and a couple of other people we've had on. And sometimes I feel like even it's kind of like deaf. It's falling on deaf ears, even as like Brigitte Gabriel, and Pam Geller. Yeah. I mean, those two women, they know what they're talking about, right? And they get depicted like they're crazy, but I'm like, no, they're not. You guys got to listen to them. But anyway, I want to respect your time, and I got to thank you for coming on our show because you rock. Yeah, you do. There's just so much. I know I could talk to you forever. And maybe when we're in heaven, we'll get to hang out. But I would love
a lot of time up there, I think.
Yeah, hey, I would love for you though to come back on and talk more about some of this when you have some more time, because I think that my goal is just to educate who God brings to this show, and because you never know who's listening, and and all that. So, and I can tell you that I did have an experience with I sell Legal Shield, which is personal insurance, and one of the goals of Legal Shield is to build a diverse and inclusive community. Well, one of the women who is in leadership happens to like Linda Sarsauer, and who she is, right? Oh yeah, with the Council on American Islamic Relations. And I was trying to learn about my business with Legal Shield, and this Muslim lady who loves Linda Sarsauer actually not only unfriended me on Facebook when she saw a post that I had put up about hell, but she also just refused to have anything to do with me because I'm a born-again Christian. And I thought, isn't it interesting that a very bold Muslim woman in a direct sales company that I happen to be a part of that talks about diversity and inclusivity unfriended me, even though I didn't do a darn thing to her, And I did tell her, I said, it's interesting, because she was complaining about my hell post, and kind of indirectly go, I can't do anything for you. And I said, well, I happen to see one of your she-heroes is Linda Sarsauer. And I said, that tells me all I need to know. And she knew exactly what I was talking about.
Oh, yeah.
I'm just saying. And I'm like, oh my gosh, So they're everywhere, everybody. That's my point, right? Okay. So Bob, tell everybody where they can get your book and anything else you'd like to. So then you can.
Okay. Well, it's my pleasure to be on your program tonight, Stacy. The book, Progressive Evil, of course, is published by Defender Publishing Group, and it's available on Amazon. In fact, at least yesterday, it was the bestseller in its category. So, I'd like to keep it in that category. So you can go to Barnes & Noble, and there are other venues that have it available. So, maybe next time, some of your listeners can get a copy and we can have a discussion about some of the material in there, because there's a lot of provocative material that I think that we, as certainly the Christian community, needs to consider. I was thinking of Christians when I wrote the book, not for a broader secular community, because I really think it's important for Christians to be awake to the culture that we live in. Don't put just stay in your Christian cocoon and look outside occasionally through a crack in the door of your church at the culture. The culture needs we Christians to be engaged in it, and we need to call evil evil. We need to be part of the political fray because it's our country. Civics, as we understand, our founders, fought a war against the monarchy and outlined 27 grievances in the Declaration of Independence. And they were mostly, not all of them, but they were mostly men of God who, understood that if you're going to have a free country, a country that's going to allow each man and woman to worship as he or she's fit, then you're going to have to be willing to pay a price. And if we don't, I'm afraid we're going to lose this country as we've known it. And if it's reformed by progressives, it's not going to be a nice place to live.
Right. Think about California people. Just saying.
Yep.
I hate to say it, but, I love California. I love the weather, but the politics I don't miss. But I don't want them also to become the politics in Tennessee or the rest of the country either. So that is it. Okay, everybody. So that's it. Hey, at the end of every show, you know what I always say, right? I always say, be bold, stand up, and go with God because he loves you. And don't forget that, right? We will be back tomorrow night at 8 p.m. Central Time. So I hope you guys have a good rest of your weekend. And thanks for tuning in for tonight's show. Appreciate it.